Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today.
Can you all hear it okay? Excellent. Okay.
As you'll see with the words not matching my mouth right now, we had a bit of a technical difficulty with our sound, but it's going to jump right back in here in a second. So thank you for joining, everyone from your backyard gardeners and community gardeners. So today, with Dig Your Dinner, we are talking about winter squash. So this is going to be, as you'll find, very similar to the pumpkin Dig Your Dinner that we did. And that's because they are essentially the same plant. And we'll kind of get into that. But genetically, they're cousins. They're basically just different varieties. But there are some nuances to know about winter squash. So I always like to start this off with a recommendation of a publication or two. Obviously, the Kansas Garden Guide would be a good one for this because it entails everything you need to know about the vegetables that will grow here in Kansas. You can get the free version online at the KSRE bookstore, or you can get a physical copy through our office at the Extension office. It's specifically the pages for winter squash and pumpkins. And as I mentioned, they're similar enough that they share pages. It will be on page 172 of this guide. And of course, other extension locations also have publications on winter squash and growing vegetables in general. So growing pumpkins and winter squash in home gardens is a good publication from the University of Minnesota Extension. Of course, anytime you are looking at other states' publications with various topics, you just want to make sure that you're taking into account that they are going to have different environmental conditions. So, winter squash overview. The few things that you should probably know from the get-go are that it's a broad name entailing many different plants. So, all of them are within the Cucurbita family. Most of your winter squash specifically are going to be within the Pepo species. Pumpkin and squash and gourds, they are all different terms kind of referring to cousins within the same family. So pumpkins are going to be round and orange. And if you are wanting to learn about pumpkins specifically, as I mentioned, or if you're not aware, there is another Dig Your Dinner out there that you can find on our YouTube channel that specifically discusses pumpkins. Squash, which we'll be discussing today, are other colors and shapes. Ultimately, still the same plant as pumpkins, but they are primarily grown for culinary purposes, as opposed to some pumpkins may be grown for obviously the aesthetic purposes. And then gourds also falls into this category, and we'll talk about gourds a little bit today, but gourds are specifically grown to be decorative. They're not edible. And so that's kind of what I wanted to illustrate on this slide itself. Here's the scope of winter squash. So as I mentioned, we've got the Pepo, Maxima, Moschata, and Angiosperma varieties and types of pumpkins here. And as you can see, they vary quite a bit. So it really just kind of depends on what your ultimate purpose is with the squash as your reasoning for growing it. Sometimes you may want the more decorative for the fall, in which case you may consider your gourds or some of your more unique looking plants like your Turk's turban or even your Hubbards. Or if you're specifically going with the culinary purposes, maybe you'd want to go with like a patty pan or a delicata or even a sweet potato or spaghetti or butternut. It just really depends on what are you trying to do? What is your purpose within growing this plant? So many various different types of benefits out there and lots of fun things to look through. So with winter squash in Kansas in particular, they perform very well if the correct maintenance is followed. So if you might be aware, if you've tried to grow pumpkins before, it can be an uphill battle if it gets out of hand too quickly. But if you are following the maintenance practices that are associated with it and kind of staying on top of the plant throughout the season, that's going to be your best bet as far as keeping it going and getting it to a place where it's producing well for you. Very similar to pumpkin growing, as I mentioned. Some varieties actually are going to be more resistant to pests, so that's something to look for. And then even your newer varieties are going to be specifically grown so that you're not getting way too much food or too little food with the type of squash that you're growing. They are actually specifically grown to be a two-person meal size. So you can find some varieties out there that are going to work with you and within what you are wanting from the plant. plant. Specifically, like the patty pan squash. I know a lot of people like to use those in their dishes just because you can easily chop them up, and that's a 1 to 2 person meal. And same thing kind of with your butternut squash or even your Turk's turban. Those aren't very large. So there's lots of different uses out there, and it just kind of depends on what you're aiming for. So when it comes to planting your winter squash, you do want to wait until the danger of frost has passed. So as soon as it is not possible anymore for frost to be happening, or historically it's not going to happen anymore, that is when you can start getting those plants in the ground and they should be safe to continue producing for you. So that means here in Kansas, it will be early to mid-May, or when the soil itself has reached 60 degrees Fahrenheit. For an October harvest, if you are aiming for a more decorative squash and you're trying to have it out during the fall season, you would want to actually plant in June because that would be the timing of that. They would be ready around October time. And for a June to July planting, you'll actually be able to avoid squash bugs more. So we'll talk about that more down the line here. But do watch the timing if you are aiming for decorative purposes, because otherwise they're probably going to be producing a little bit earlier in the season for you than autumn. The standard vining types do need at least 12-inch rows, or I'm sorry, not 12-inch, 12 feet rows, and with 4 to 5 feet between plants. So that's just your standard spacing for your squash, really. Keep that in mind because they do tend to become very large, sprawling plants, even if you are trying to grow it upward on a trellis or something along those lines. It is still going to be a very large plant. So be sure that it gets adequate space, and be sure you leave enough space for you yourself to be able to get into there and do the maintenance that you need to do, as well as the harvesting. The seeds themselves, they are pretty big, so you'll want to plant those about an inch deep. And the best soil pH for this type of plant is going to be just slightly acidic, below neutral at your 6 to 6.5. Generally around here, our pH, it tends to lean towards alkaline, right in the 8.0 range. So a little bit of a sulfur application in there is generally going to help you out. But if you are, still working in your garden right now, or if you're wanting to get ready for next year, actually here in the fall is the best time to be doing your soil testing and amending right now in this season, because it's going to give your soil time to incorporate those amendments throughout the off season until the growing season, and it's going to give any amendments that might be a little bit more extreme, like a manure, time to cool off so it won't be burning your plants by the time they're actually growing. Also, keep in mind with your squash, they can be prone to root rot, so you do want good drainage in that soil. So when it comes to winter squash care, you do want to keep in mind that there's going to be a lot of space between these plants before they fully establish. Eventually, once these vines do fully spread, you are going to somewhat form a dense canopy over the ground, and that's going to help with suppressing your weeds in general. But until then, it's bare ground, which means a lot of opportunity for weeds to sprout and to compete against your plants. So staying on top of those weeds initially is going to be very beneficial to your plants because it's going to prevent pests from harboring nearby. It's also going to prevent less airflow from happening in the area, which is going to prevent disease formation, because more airflow means less disease with that less humidity that will be there. So a good way to stay on top of that actually is just your shallow cultivation. You do want to stay a little bit shallow so you're not disturbing the roots of the plant itself, but just severing those weeds as they emerge is going to help. A little extra water then as the plant continues to grow, specifically when it is flowering and when it is early fruiting, is going to help with the fruit development itself. Remember, these are generally big fruits that are forming on there, or a lot bigger than, say, a tomato or something on those lines. So big fruit equals more moisture. You're going to have to provide the moisture for that fruit to develop. Also, these are very, very heavily influenced by pollinators and how many are present and how effectively they are pollinating. So you do want to encourage your pollinators to be nearby. And a little bit more on that. So looking at blooming and pollination, when you look at your squash, they do have both male and female flowers. The male will be the ones with pollen, the female will be the ones with the seeds. And generally speaking, the male flowers are going to outnumber the female flowers 2 to 3 to 1. So there is a lot of pollen there and a lot of potential for pollination, but at the same time, there are some nuances to that. The flowers close at the end of the day, so there's really only that sunlight window for them to be pollinated. And if there's not enough pollinators nearby, you may get severely deformed fruit. So this is a pumpkin example over here on the right, but that would be an example of a gourd or a squash in general, not a gourd, gourds are decorative, but a squash in general that's has not adequately been pollinated, and as a result, it's deformed. So encouraging more pollinators, there's several tricks there. It can be as simple as having more and more flowers nearby, or say some native plants nearby that have lots of pollen sources. But it also comes down to your pest control strategy and what kind of pesticides you're using in general in your garden. You have to remember, even if you are not treating your vegetable garden, if you are treating, say, an ornamental garden nearby, that could be harming your beneficial insect population. So you need to be looking at any kind of treatments that are happening in your garden. If they're detrimental to pollinators, I'd consider looking for an organic option or an alternative option. Or if it's one of those situations where you absolutely have to use a synthetic chemical, really should be applied early in the morning or later in the evening to avoid that window when the pollinators are actively moving around. And as far as treating flowers themselves go, try to avoid it in general, because that's obviously going to be a prime ground to come in contact with those pollinators. So I do want to talk about trellising, because that is a pretty common practice when it comes to your winter squash specifically. Now, it does depend on the actual variety that you're trying to work with. Some do not vine very well. They're more of a shrub type. And then also, some are just going to be too large to be able to really sustain that kind of weight. Now, it's not impossible. You've probably seen photos in the past of people growing full pumpkins hanging off of a trellis. It's possible, but you do really have to baby it, and you've got to be keeping a sharp eye onto it. The structure itself needs to be able to withstand potentially hundreds of pounds of weight. So you see the example here, that's some pretty hefty metal in this hoop that is holding those gourds. Or not gourds, I keep saying gourds, they're squash. They could be decorative, they're gourds. So with that, just keep in mind, you want to be looking at the specific growing traits of the squash that you are working with. And the actual smaller the squash that you're trying to grow, like the delicata squash here, the better they're really going to hang for you. Also, keep in mind that it's not just allowing it to grow in there. You're probably going to, at some point, need to create hammocks for these squash, especially if they grow a little bit larger. People will use bandanas, pantyhose. I've also seen little like net structures people have used. Really anything that can kind of just help hold that weight, so the onus is not solely on that stem of the plant. And so actually here, there's a good example of that. Well, not the hammocks itself, but the squash growing on a trellis itself. So your butternuts at a smaller size can probably usually hold their weight. And the way that you actually know your squash are ready, which is what this slide is about, is you want to do a fingernail test with the rinds of the squash. Typically, if the rind cannot be punctured by a fingernail, then it's ready to go. Um, Also, when you do the severing of the stem itself, it shouldn't be succulent anymore. So you can see over here on the right again that the plant is pretty much fully dried out. The more dried out, it's kind of the better. So when you do remove these, try not to rip them off the plant still, because those stems will be pretty sturdy. So use a sharp pair of pruners and go ahead and sever the stem that way. A light freeze will not be damaging with your squash, but you do want to avoid hard freezes. So those mid to low 20s, that's where you want to have everything out of the garden before that happens. And so when it comes to storing your winter squash, you actually want to do it immediately after harvesting. So allow for further drying because it does need to cure for a bit afterwards because that succulence will still be a little bit there in the stem. And to do that, you want to place it in a 70 to 80 degree dry location for 2 to 3 weeks. Just allow it to kind of harden off even more in that dry, warm location. Then, as far as long-term storage with your winter squash specifically, you can actually end up storing them for up to 4 to 8 months. So really, if you're trying to grow these as a garden staple that's going to hold throughout the winter until the new growing season comes around, it's possible with your winter squash, especially if you can get ample production from it. But you do need to watch the specific storing conditions in that they want to be in 50 to 60 degree temperatures, dry location, no injuries on the plant itself. That is going to be your best scenario for holding them over that long. So I did want to delve in a bit to all of the potential issues that you can have with squash, because if you've tried to grow squash or zucchinis or say pumpkins before, you do know that there are some pretty significant pests out there that can really kind of be a detriment to your production in general. So aphids, very common one with those. I would just recommend a neem oil and again, try to encourage those beneficial insects through having some kind of pollinator garden nearby. Cucumber beetles, that will also be controlled with neem oil, and also crop rotation helps quite a bit with those. You can also try delayed planting with cucumber beetles. Typically, I would say late May to early June. If you get your squash in around that time, then you will be lowering those populations or the amount in your garden that will be affecting your plants, and that will help with preventing some various diseases that they actually vector. Fusarium wilt, as you see in the middle left over here, is pretty common. That is controlled through crop rotation. So really, in general, if you are growing any kind of squash or any squash that might be related to your winter squash, um, try to rotate out of that area in the garden, put something else there. And the general time window for crop rotation that you're looking at is 2 to 3 years. So hopefully you have enough space, but even a year will help if you only have that amount of space to work with. Top throw blight is another option. With that, you'll probably be looking at a fungicide, or you'll just want to be eradicating the plants entirely from the garden, trying to get any of that plant debris out of there so that you don't have any of those remnant disease uh, spores or what have you uh, persisting. Poor fruit set is another one. So you'll see that on the bottom right here. As I mentioned, poor pollination can be very common with plants. So again, just encourage your pollinators. And then with these last three here, powdery mildew, squash bug, and squash vine borer, I wanted to dive a little bit further in. So it's a very common issue to have powdery mildew on your crops, specifically the squash crops. And these can actually result in up to a 30% yield loss. They don't actually affect the fruits of the plant itself, but what they do affect is the leaves of the plants to a point where they don't photosynthesize as well, so they're not feeding the plant as well, and they're also not shading the fruit as well. So that is where the yield loss comes in. With those two factors, you're suddenly going to start having less and less quality in the production of your plants. So this will generally start appearing on your squash in early August. It's instigated by warm daytime temperatures. And what you'll want to do to control these in general is to look at a late July through early August um, application before your symptoms even start appearing. It's one of those deals where if you know it's coming, or if you've had a really humid year or very moisture heavy year, it's likely going to show up. So that is when you'll want to come in with a fungicide application, that late July to early August window. And there's many different options here, but you can look at azoxystrobin, trifloxystrobin, pyroclasstrobin, and thofenate methyl. Um, I probably butchered all of those, and I apologize. But point being that those are the active ingredients that are known to treat powdery mildew. You'll want to follow your label instructions very diligently. Be sure to watch for any kind of safety precautions that it recommends and follow those very diligently. And if there is a window where you need to not be consuming those crops after application, definitely watch that as well. So squash bugs is probably the question that most people watching this have right now. And control them can be tricky, but it's not impossible. The thing with squash bugs is their eggs are rock solid, and then their adults basically have a very hard armor on them. So those two factors make it so that really the nymph stage is the only stage where effective control with a chemical can really happen. So that's where you kind of have to come in with all of your other options that aren't chemical to try to control these things. Um, so the best thing you can do is always scout underneath the leaves for the eggs, as they should be showing up in midsummer. And as you see those eggs start to appear, what you'll do is you'll take that entire chunk of the leaf off the plants and throw that into soapy water instead of trying to crush them because they're just too hard to crush. It will look like your plant has been torn up, but as long as you're not fully breaking up that leaf or you're not breaking the big veins of the leaf, it should be able to continue functioning without killing it. Um, Also, there is a trick that a lot of people will try. Your squash bugs like to aggregate or congregate, I can't remember the difference between those two words, under a board in the morning to stay warm. So what you can do is actually place the board right next to your garden and lift it up in the morning, and they will all be right there for you to scoop up and throw into soapy water. So really, it's about minimizing populations. And with minimizing populations, actually the most effective control that I probably should have mentioned first here is that if you just delay the planting of your squash until June-ish, or mid-June, you're missing the entire first generation of squash bugs that are going to be showing up outside. So in doing so, you've just halved the population of squash bugs that are really going to be affecting your plants. Remember, squash bugs have piercing, sucking mouth parts that essentially drain all the nutrients from your fruits, from your plants themselves. So with a much minimized population, it's not going to be affecting the plant as much in general. That's not the sole control, but it is a piece of the control. So in doing that, in addition to scouting for eggs, in addition to watching the ones that do show up and scooping those out and throwing them into soapy water, you're going to reduce the pests enough that it's not going to be able to really affect the plant too bad. So just remember, with squash bugs, it really is an integrated pest management approach where you have to take not one method, but several methods of controlling this. And those several methods together are what is going to be the most effective in controlling them. Now, there's also squash vine borer that's become a more and more prominent issue in squash in the last few years, especially here in the Kansas City area. The best practices to know with this or recommendations with this would be plant removal, soil sterilization, which we'll talk about in a slide here, and crop rotation, just to acknowledge that they're there and try to minimize those populations and kill those populations altogether. Because as much as you can try to treat them or address them, they can still hide in the soil. And they spread by a moth, and that moth actually lays their eggs right at the base of the plant, and then the plant gets the larvae from those hatching eggs, boring through their vines. And so what you can do if you know they're there, you can actually split your vines open and pull those grubs out, and then try to just seal it back up with some gardener's tape or something along those lines, and keep it from not being exposed to elements. And it may actually survive and keep producing for you. But best practice really is going to be just your plant removal and getting it out of the garden once they do show. There are some insecticides that are labeled for squash vine borer. They are going to be your harsher insecticides. The biggest thing to know with them as well is that they are going to have to be applied to the plants before the larvae ever begin boring. So generally speaking, your larvae, I think they get laid around mid-June. You'll want to have your plants fully treated before then. And you can reach out to the extension office for more options when it comes to chemical control. So I mentioned soil solarization. What is that? That is the process of essentially covering your soil plots with a sheet of plastic that is going to harness the sun's rays and cook the soil that is underneath. It is a three month-ish process. It takes about at least 6 weeks, but 3 months is the recommended time, really, to sterilize anything that's underneath that tarp. So it's not just your pests, but it's also going to be any weed seeds. It's going to be any diseases that are in there. It can be very beneficial if you have a lot of pest issues in the garden. But you've got to keep in mind that it kills everything that's underneath, which includes your beneficial soil microorganisms and that whole microbiome that is underneath that soil. So what that means is after that tarp gets pulled off, you're going to have to go back in and you're going to have to reintroduce those microorganisms and rebuild that soil microbiome. And you can actually do that with compost because compost is made from microorganisms breaking down organic matter. So reincorporating that into a bed that has been solarized, you will essentially jumpstart that soil again. Then I did just want to mention real quick, debris removal is going to be very helpful with a lot of pest control and a lot of disease control when it comes to your squash. So at the end of the season, once you've harvested all of your crops, be sure that you're getting everything out of there, not just the vines. Really go kind of diligently through that soil plots and try to get all the leaves and plant debris out of there. And that will help quite a bit with getting rid of a lot of those pests. And I always like to end these with something fun. So, did you know that winter squash are native to Mexico, and they have been cultivated for over 10,000 years? So that's why we've got so many varieties out there, so many different kinds and uses. It's very cool. So the ancient peoples in that region recognize their value as a long-term storage crop, and the plants have been an important winter food source ever since. And with that, here's my contact information. You can reach me at my email listed here. Or, of course, we have our Master Gardener hotline here at the Johnson County office that is happy to answer any questions you may have as well. Thank you.
All right. Well, for those of you that joined a little bit late, Anthony is not here with us in person. So if you have any questions on the growing, harvesting, anything like that, do put them in the chat and I will make sure that he gets them and he'll follow up when he is back in the office to be able to provide those answers for you. So I'll give you just a minute. If you have any questions, put them in the chat now. Of course, you can put them in during my portion of the presentation as well, or at the end, I'll leave some more time for some questions. So I'm going to move into my portion now. And for those of you that are joining a little bit late as well, and if you haven't attended any of our previous sessions, my name is Chelsea. I am the Nutrition, Food Safety, and Health Agent here in the Extension Office for Johnson County. I'm going to talk about the nutrition and some of the health benefits and some of the other ways to use our recipes and all that good stuff with our squash. So winter squash, as Anthony mentioned, there are many, many different varieties. Most of them are going to be very nutrient dense varieties. And so that's a great thing, especially kind of as we move into these winter months, making sure that we're getting all of our vitamins and minerals and eating nutrient dense foods. Of course, some of the varieties are more popular than others. Traditionally, we have our spaghetti squash, acorn squash, butternut, and even buttercup, I would say, is becoming a little bit more popular. But several of those that Anthony had mentioned in his portion of the presentation, you really can't find many recipes for, and you can't really find much information from a nutrition perspective. But then again, they are all part of that same family, as Anthony had mentioned as well, and therefore nutritionally, they're going to be very similar. Unlike summer squash, many of our winter squash have that hard outer shell, and that does need to be removed before consuming. So it's not like our zucchini or our yellow squash. They generally have a hardier flesh as well. And they're larger, and they have also edible seeds. And we're going to talk about the seeds because the seeds do provide a lot of that great nutrition. So here's just a little bit of a detail on some of the flavor profiles, especially if you're not familiar with some of these other squashes that Anthony had mentioned. We have the patty pan. It is similar to a summer squash in terms of like that flavor, but it holds up much better when cooking. And again, that's because of that flesh. It's a little bit heartier and a little bit thicker. We have a Hubbard, which is a dense, more starchy flesh. So understanding how you might use it, it is going to be starchier. It works well in mixed dishes and holds up a little bit better. The Turk's Turban, it does have a slight hazelnut flavor. It has a smooth and almost floury flesh texture. The Japanese pumpkin pie pumpkin, it's sweeter and denser than our traditional pie pumpkins, which actually tends to work out a little bit better if you're trying to reduce the amount of added sugar that you're consuming. Because they are sweeter, you can use less sugar than a traditional pumpkin, like a pumpkin pie or pumpkin dessert that you might be using it with. And then the delicata, it's a similar taste and texture to a sweet potato. And then we have that green striped couchot, which is the texture is more meaty and fibrous. And some people say it has almost even like a slight smoky flavor when it's roasted. Again, I personally haven't had any of these other ones that are listed on this slide. We will go into more detail about our more traditional ones that we might find that we either grow ourselves, find in the farmer's market, or even in your traditional supermarket. So starting out, we have our winter squash. As I mentioned, it's rich in nutrition. It's generally a very low in calorie food, and the fiber can be quite high in some varieties. Generally thinking about our squashes, they all tend to have this yellow orange color, and that is going to be a lot of our vitamin A. We have vitamin C, our B vitamins, magnesium, potassium, antioxidants, and again, specifically those carotenoids, which is that orange yellow color. We have our healthy fats from our seeds, and we have vitamin E and iron that's also common in our seeds. So again, winter squash, they are so nutrient dense and generally how we prepare them. We don't add a ton of extra ingredients, whether it's added sugar or salt or sodium. So they can be quite nutritious and add to our diet. And what makes it great is they do hold, as Anthony mentioned, for several months. And so it's such a great way to just make sure that we're having a steady supply of nutrient-rich foods all year round. So, some health benefits of our winter squashes. Regular consumption may reduce the risk of certain chronic diseases. So, there's been some research that has looked at consumption of our winter squashes, and they found that there has been correlation with reduction of cardiovascular disease. A study looked at heart disease risk, and it decreased by 23% for every additional daily serving of a yellow orange vegetable. So, that goes to our acorn squash, our butternut squash, our spaghetti squash. So adding those into your daily diet can help reduce your risk of cardiovascular disease. It has been associated with a reduce of type 2 diabetes. This again is because all of those antioxidants and it's a fiber-rich food, as well as a lower calorie and quite a bit of reduced starch and carbohydrates when we think of like a spaghetti squash compared to our regular pasta. Reduction in cancer, and then cognitive decline. Higher levels of carotenoids, which are those yellow and orange antioxidants that we get from our orange and yellow fruits and vegetables, they were associated with a lower cognitive decline in participants over the age of 65. So, again, adding our nutrient rich foods, all of our squashes, into our daily diet, and not just eating on occasion, but adding it as really a robust part of our daily diet can help reduce the risk of certain chronic diseases. So now I'm going to move into the kind of four main squashes that you might grow or you might find in markets and grocery stores. I'm going to start with our spaghetti squash. The flavor profile, it's kind of mild, sweet, and a slightly nutty flavor. Generally, people will bake, roast, broil, or steam the spaghetti squash. After you use one of those methods, it might actually be sauteed in some oil or butter in addition, which then can help to bring out some of those flavors. And if it's in a mixed dish, you can also use the slow cooker or pressure cooker for faster cooking. Spaghetti squash, I've done my spaghetti squash in the microwave before, piercing the outer shells, so some of that steam releases, but it does go a little bit faster if you're looking for a quick and easy meal, trying to get it on the table, and also not wanting to cut those squashes in half. Squashes can be quite difficult to cut, especially because of that hard outer shell. So softening it in the microwave also is another great tip. You can, if you don't want to cook it in the microwave, but you just want to soften it, pierce it, just cook it for a few minutes, which will help soften that outer shell and makes it a little bit easier to cut through that hard shell. Once the spaghetti squash is cooked, the flesh pulls away from the shell into strands resembling angel hair pasta, hence the name spaghetti squash. Generally, spaghetti squash is used as a low carb replacement for pasta, especially for diabetics or if we're talking about other people who are just trying to reduce overall carbohydrate consumption. So per 1 cup comparison, 1 cup of spaghetti pasta versus 1 cup of spaghetti squash, we have 10 grams of carbohydrates in our spaghetti squash versus 43 grams of carbohydrates in our spaghetti, compared to 42 calories in our spaghetti squash versus 220 calories in our spaghetti. So it does make quite a bit of difference if we're looking at overall weight reduction or just eating a little bit healthier, adding some more fiber into our diet. Um, the spaghetti squash is not quite as high in vitamins and minerals as some of our other winter squashes, but that doesn't mean that there's no nutrition. It still is a good source of a lot of our different vitamins and minerals. It's just not quite as many as some of our other squashes. And it does provide 2 cups of fiber, 2 grams of fiber per cup. Some ideas for how to use spaghetti squash. There's some pictures here on the right. Beyond just using it as a pasta substitute, you can do like stuffed bowls, stuffed squash bowls. So that middle picture, we have our cooked spaghetti squash, and they filled it with broccoli and feta, onions, peppers, chickpeas. It's a great way you can kind of make your little boat and then just eat it out right out of the shelf. So saves you a plate and a bowl from getting too dirty by mixing everything together. You can also, once you kind of pull it apart, you can combine it into fritters. You can add it to a casserole. Hash browns is another great way, mixing it with some like eggs and breadcrumbs and forming it into a little patty and kind of frying it up in a pan is another great way for another option for using spaghetti squash. Moving on to our acorn squash. This acorn squash is sweet, buttery, and a nutty flavor. And this one does work well with our sweet or savory dishes. So our spaghetti squash is more traditionally our savory dishes. Acorn squash works well for sweet or savory. Traditionally, I would say people put their butter and brown sugar on their acorn squash, but there's a lot of other ways to do it. So we have baking, roasting, mashing. The texture is moist and it may be a little stringy, so you have to just be careful of how you're mashing it. And if you're using it in like a baked product or something, it might be a little more stringy, but you could certainly use it as like a mashed potato substitute or something like that. The acorn squash does provide a lot more fiber than our other squashes. So at 9 grams per cup cubed, it is a really high source. Generally speaking, people should consume about 25 to 31 grams of fiber every day. So this is well helping you get along your way to meeting those needs. The acorn squash is the one squash that shell is the most edible because it's a little bit thinner and definitely gets soft when it's cooked. So once that shell is cooked, certainly you can eat it and it adds more fiber. A lot of people don't, but it does provide that great fiber and really from a taste or texture standpoint, it doesn't change the overall quality of your final dish that much. So other ideas, you can stuff your acorn squash just like you can stuff your butternut or excuse me, your spaghetti squash. This top picture here has some cranberries and looks like maybe some brown sugar, some walnuts. Again, that might be a more sweeter dish, but you could stuff your acorn squash with stuffing during the Thanksgiving time of year. Add some turkey, some other vegetables and mixed in with it. You can also cook and freeze the acorn squash. We traditionally think of just eating it fresh or maybe cooked, but freezing it and then adding it to smoothies, right? It's going to add a lot of fiber. It's going to kind of provide that sweet, buttery, nutty flavor that we might be looking for. You can mash it. You can add it to salads, as you can kind of see in this picture, just roasted and sliced up. And you can also puree and add it to baked goods. So we think about sweet potato bread, but you could certainly substitute out some acorn squash for your sweet potato and have a delicious baked bread as well with it. Again, you have your savory dishes, trying some sage pork and onion, and a sweet dish, right? Your maple syrup, cranberries, and walnuts. Butternut squash. Butternut squash is probably my favorite. It is a pain to cut though, especially if you get one of those really large ones, but it is a sweet, nutty, rich flavor. This is also one that tends to work well for sweet or savory dishes. Generally, people will bake, roast, broil, braise, mash, or steam. The vitamin A in our butternut squash is the highest out of all of our winter squashes. Vitamin A, we know, is really important for regulating cell growth, eye health, bone health, and immune function. So we think about our winter months and kind of rolling into cold season and keeping our immune system nice and healthy. Loading up on all of our squashes will be a great benefit to support our immune function. The butternut squash does provide about 3 grams of fiber per 1 cup cubed, and it is a great source of our carotenoids, which are those antioxidants. They give it the plant that bright orange color. And how that works in our body is we basically convert these carotenoids into the active form of vitamin A. So intaking them, it's an antioxidant, and then we also are able to utilize all of that in a vitamin A form. So with the butternut squash, if you haven't ever tried butternut squash in other ways besides just roasted and chopped up, there's so many different ways to make it. Making some homemade fries, you kind of slice up your butternut squash into little fries and air frying them or roasting them in the oven is a great way. Pureeing it and adding it to baked goods, soups, or pasta dishes. It's great as a sauce for our pasta, as you can see here in that bottom right picture. It works wonders with our pasta. It holds up really well. And then a butternut squash soup, personally, is one of my favorite. You can't really go wrong with a butternut squash soup, as that top picture shows. So, talking about squash and the seeds, we do know that the seeds are all edible in all of our squashes. So that's a great news, right? We tend to just toss them out, but we keep our pumpkin squash seeds, but you can actually keep all of your other winter squash seeds. They are edible. So they do provide a nutty, savory flavor. Generally, you're just going to roast them. That's going to be the primary way that you're going to preserve them and cook them. The key here with our seeds is that we don't want to overcook them. They do turn bitter if you overcook them. So generally, you're going to take out the flesh, you're going to take the stringy parts off. You might rinse them, get them nice and clean, pat them dry, and then roast them with just a little bit of olive oil or another type of oil. You can definitely add seasonings for flavorings. And then once you roast them, you actually can freeze any extras that you have on hand so that you have them around available any time of year. Nuts and seeds, they do have oils and fats in them, so they will go rancid if they're not taken care of correctly. So putting them in the freezer is going to keep them the freshest, the longest. So use all those seeds, don't throw them out, adding them to soup, salads, or enjoy as a snack. As you saw in that previous picture, our butternut squash soup, right? You use your butternut squash, you smash it up, you puree it, and you make your soup. Go ahead and toss some of those seeds that you had also from the butternut squash, roast them, and add them to your soup for some crunch and some texture and some more iron and other nutrients. So preserving our winter squash, your recommendation is pressure canning only. You need an average about 16 pounds to produce 7 quarts or about 10 pounds for 9 pints. You're going to wash and remove your seeds and you're going to cut them into 1 inch wide slices. And then you're going to also peel them. We do not want to preserve the outer shell, just like you don't eat, especially for our butternut and our other squashes. We want to peel it. You're going to just cut those flesh into 1 inch cubes. You're going to boil it just for a couple minutes, and then you're going to add those cubes to your jars with that cooking liquid that you boiled it in. You want to leave 1 inch headspace, so leaving plenty of space. And then you're going to process 55 minutes for pints and 90 minutes for quarts. And make sure that you are adjusting for elevation. We do have a variety of elevations in here in Johnson County, ranging from 8 to 900 to just over 1,000. And if you are over 1,000 feet, then you do need to adjust slightly for your elevation. One key thing here with preserving our winter squash is we do not want to mash or puree. There actually are no safe guidelines for this type of product. If you have old food preservation books, you might find a recipe in there for mash or pureed. But what research has found is that the density and the texture can be so different based on the different types of products, and that there's really not a uniform time that has determined that what is going to be safest for the duration of cooking and all that stuff. So cubes is going to be your preferred route and the only recommended route. If you do want to mash or puree, we recommend just freezing it. There is no recommendations for dehydration. They just tend to not hold up real well. Generally speaking, it's freezing is your better preferred method, or canning them. You could possibly substitute butternut squash puree. If you go to the National Center for Home Food Preservation website, they have a pumpkin leather recipe. So it's just basically like a dried leather, like a fruit leather. And they have all of that listed out for you. And the pumpkin, you could probably substitute the butternut squash and get a similar quality product. Personally, I have not done that, but a lot of our squashes are interchangeable, especially for something like that, that you're just substituting out one for the other in an equal ratio. And then we have our freezing. You're going to, make sure that you're not doing the outer shell. Same thing. You want to just soften it. So we're gonna cook until it's soft, either in boiling water, you're gonna steam it, you can cook it in a pressure cooker, an oven. You're gonna remove your pulp and your rind, and you can go ahead and mash it up. Like anytime you're freezing something, you do lose water. So if you want it to stay in like a nice cube form, when you roast it, it might not turn out quite the same. So again, mashing might give you a better quality, a better final product, especially if you're just going to puree into soups, or add it to sauces, or add it to to your baked goods as like a mixed in ingredient. So here are some recipes. We have a butternut squash quinoa and chicken soup. We have a whole butternut squash that you're going to roast in the oven. We have our chicken breasts. The other ingredients are just our standard onion, garlic, some chicken stock. We do want to use unsalted, but if unsalted is unavailable, choosing a low sodium. And if only the full sodium version is available, just leave out the salt at the end for seasoning purposes. And then you're going to use some stewed tomatoes. You can certainly do chopped tomatoes if that's all you had in your pantry as well, and some oregano. And then lastly, we have our quinoa. If you don't have quinoa, you could substitute farro or barley or any other of our grains that would hold up really well. There are the ingredients. Take a screenshot with your phone, or get the recording after if you are wanting the full directions. I'm not going to read through each of those, but you just kind of cook it. You do puree the butternut squash, so it is a soup and it's not in chunks, but it is a pureed kind of liquid that you get. You're going to mix that with your stock, and then you have your butternut squash puree, your chicken and quinoa, and you add that together, and it is a delicious recipe. We have shrimp scampi with spaghetti squash. Again, using spaghetti squash as a spaghetti substitute. This picture, it does look like spaghetti because I couldn't find a close enough resemblance to our spaghetti squash. But we have just all of our different ingredients, from butter, olive oil. We kind of have a half and half here. So again, butter provides some great richness and depth for recipes. So instead of doing 4 tablespoons of butter, we're just cutting in half. So we're keeping some of that saturated fat down and replacing it with some of those healthier, heart-healthy olive oil fats. We have our garlic, onion. We're using red onion. You could use any type of onion you have on hand though, and fresh parsley or dried parsley if you don't have fresh. And then we have a little bit of Worcestershire sauce for just some depth and umami flavor, some lemon juice. We have our spaghetti squash, and then we have our shrimp and a little bit of our cooking wine. You could add fresh peas, some broccoli, any other type of vegetable that you would want to add as well. And then a little bit of our cheese to top it. Asiago or Parmesan works really well. If you don't like shrimp and you want to do something else, you could do chicken, and really you could use this exact same kind of scampi sauce recipe with chicken, and it'll also turn out delicious. We have a stuffed acorn squash. This is kind of one of my favorites for this time of year. Using some Italian sausage, you could use chicken, turkey, or pork, mushrooms, some onions, a red apple, right? So we get some of that sweet and savory mixed together. We have some of those more traditional fall seasonings like our nutmeg, allspice, garlic, thyme, and rosemary. These could be fresh or dried if you do not have fresh available, and some Parmesan cheese. So you'll cook your squash. We want it to be nice and tender and soft in the middle. You're going to cook your sausage and your mushrooms and get them all nice and done and soft, and your apple and nutmeg. We want it to still have a little bit of that crunch. Again, texture is really key when we're thinking about eating. And so keeping it so it's not mushy, but keeping a little bit of that texture for our apple. You'll scoop out some of that flesh of your acorn, leaving a little bit of a wall, and then you're going to kind of add that extra mixture with your sausage mix, and then you just basically put it back in your acorn bowls and top with some of that cheese. And then our last one is a buttercup recipe. A buttercup, I didn't go into the details about the nutrition, but it's going to be very similar to all of our other squash recipes. And it does have a pretty similar taste to our butternut squash. So here we have our buttercup squash that's just going to be sliced and are going to have our seeds removed. And basically, you're going to cut them into wedges and arrange them on a layer of baking sheets. You're going to drizzle with your olive oil, a little bit of that maple syrup, and cinnamon and salt. And then you're going to roast them in the oven until they're nice and soft and tender. And then you just serve it on a platter and you top it with some goat cheese, some toasted seeds or nuts, whatever you prefer. And then even topping it with some pomegranate seeds or some fresh chopped parsley to give it a little bit of that color, or rosemary or whatever it is you may have. But this is just another great way that can be kind of an optional salad that is the more non-traditional way of maybe serving something for the holidays. And with that, that is all I have for my portion of the presentation. Here is my contact information. We have my direct email as well as our kind of general food help email. And then, of course, as always, if you are not currently signed up for our newsletter, please sign up. We provide a monthly e-newsletter that has a recipe of the month, has lots of great additional information. And are there any questions or anything in the chat?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Okay. The last squash, that buttercup,
Mhm.
are those at most of the local stores, or I've not seen them?
I haven't seen them. I've had a buttercup from somebody that was growing it personally themselves. There
Okay.
might be a few farmers in the farmers markets that have some floating around, but it is, again, it's not one that you'll commonly find in your supermarkets or
Okay.
anything like that.
Is it a little firmer texture than perhaps when it's cooked, like the egg, like the butternut?
Yeah, it's very similar to a butternut. I
Okay.
would say from a size perspective, at least the one that I had was a little bit smaller in size as well, so it made it a nice serving.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. If you have any other questions that you think of, again, reach out at any time. Next month we are doing horseradish and parsnips. So if you haven't cooked with any of those before, come and learn and listen to some new ways of using it. Personally, I don't like horseradish, but there are some ways that I found that I have enjoyed it, and from a culinary perspective. And then parsnips are, I feel like, an underutilized vegetable in our food kind of armor that we got going on here. So join us next month, and we look forward to seeing you all again in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Have a good day.